In this video, we're going to take a look at the logic surrounding loop structures. The advantage of having loops in our program gives us the ability to repeat instructions over and over again until a specific goal is reached. When we can repeat instructions, we have fewer instructions in our code, which means that we have less time required for designing and writing our code. We have fewer possibilities of error, and we have a shorter compile time. If we had to retype those instructions over and over again, or use a copy and paste, we're introducing the possibility for more errors. Our code becomes lengthier, and the time in which it will take to compile becomes longer. What types of applications are good for using loops? If you're in a situation where you are going to process a sequence of input values until a sentinel is received, a loop is a good choice. If you need to repeat a series of calculations over and over again, then a loop is a good choice. What types of loops do we have available to us in programming? Typically, you have three different types of loop structures. You have a while loop, a for loop, and a do loop. In a while loop, instructions are executed repeatedly while a condition is true. In a for loop, execution of instructions are repeated for a given number of times. And in a do loop, the instructions are actually executed once. Then we test a condition to determine whether we repeat those instructions, and we'll repeat them if the condition is true. In a while loop and a do loop, the condition as to whether we continue to execute those steps is usually controlled by an event. In a for loop, repeating the instructions is controlled usually by a counter. In a while loop and in a for loop, the condition is tested before the execution of the instructions. In a do loop, the instructions are executed first, then the condition is tested to determine whether we continue repeating those instructions, and only repeats if that condition is true. Let's take a look at the flowcharts surrounding each of these different loop structures. In a while loop, we test our condition first. If the condition is true, we are going to fall into the body of the loop and execute the instructions, and then come and test the condition again to see whether we continue repeating those instructions or if we continue on with the program. If the condition is false, we continue on. If the condition is false when we come to this point, the loop instructions are not even executed. In a for loop, a loop is the loop is controlled by a index. In other words, we are going to repeat the series of instructions for a certain number of iterations. So we need an index counter of some kind. So we set our counter first at the beginning. We test the condition to see whether that index is below a certain value. If it is, if the condition is true, we're going to execute the loop instructions. We're going to increment that counter, our index value, and then we're going to test the condition and continue that loop until our index value or counter reaches a certain value, and then the condition will be false and we continue on with the program. In a do loop, we actually execute the loop instructions once before we even test whether we should continue to repeat those instructions. So the loop body is set before the condition. We test our condition, and we only continue to repeat those loop instructions if that condition is true. If the condition is false, we'll just continue on with the program. Let's take a look at an example of looping. Let's say we want to execute a sequence of statements 6 times. In a while loop, we need to set a index value or a counter equal to 0 and then test whether that counter is less than 6. So in our statement here, while I is less than 6, as long as I is less than 6, as long as that is true, we're going to execute what is within the curly brackets. So we'll execute the body statements, and then each time before we test the condition again, we need to increment our counter variable I by 1. We do that by saying I is equal to I plus 1, or we can also do I plus plus. So that loop will continue and actually execute 6 times before it drops down. When the condition is false, that is, I is 6 or greater, then we fall below the bracket, the last bracket, and continue on with the program. In a for loop, to do this, we set our counter variable equal to 0, we have our test condition I less than 6, and we increment our index all in the for loop instruction at the top. And then we execute the body statements over and over and over again until I is equal to 6 or greater. In a do loop, we're going to set our counter variable equal to 0. We're going to execute the body statements once. We're going to increment our counter variable y1, and then we'll test whether I is less than or equal to 6. And we'll continue doing that until I is 6 or greater. So which type of loop actually is the best choice when we know we want to do the series of statements 6 times? A for loop makes the better choice because the incrementing of the counter variable is actually done within the for loop itself, within the instruction of the for loop, and not needing to be embedded within the body of the statements. If it's in the body of the statements, a lot of times the incrementing of that variable is forgotten. Also, there's fewer lines of code necessary to be written. Let's look at the notation surrounding loops. It is recommended that the body of a loop be surrounded by curly brackets. It isn't always necessary to have the curly brackets. If you're in a situation like this, where we have only one statement that we're repeating over and over again, you don't necessarily need the curly brackets. But we want to use them because it makes the logic more readable, or makes our programs more readable. We can understand the logical flow of the program better. So let's take a look at all of these different ways to write the same code, and you decide for yourself which one is actually easier to read. This one here on the far left with the brackets and the white space and the indentation used. This one here where the brackets are removed. This one here where we've even condensed the lines further and made less white space. This last one here has a curly brackets, but it is not indented using white space. Every single one of these does the exact same thing and would produce the same result. Let's take a look at an example of a while loop. Here we've written a program that is going to print all the squares less than 100. So we're going to start our numbering at 0, and we're going to take that number and we're going to square it or raise it to the power of 2 until that square is equal to 10 or equal to 100. So here we have our number. We have to declare it and initialize it. Then we test our condition, and we're going to loop through the body of the instructions, printing out the square repeatedly, increment our number by 1, and then test that condition again, and we do that until our square is 100 or greater. The same program can be written with a for loop. With a for loop, our number is actually declared and initialized inside of the for loop. The condition is set, and our incrementing is in there in that loop as well. In a do loop that prints a square is less than 100, we test the condition at the end, so the body of the loop instructions are executed at least once before the condition is even tested. Each one of these programs produces the same output. In summary, the types of loops that are available to us are while loops, for loops, and do loops. Each loop requires the following steps. We need to initialize or set up a variable that starts the looping. We need a condition to test to see if we will continue executing the loop body. And then we need to update or change something each time. So in a for loop, what we're changing each time is we're incrementing our index variable for the number of times that we're going to execute the for loop. And in a while or do loop, we update a variable that then is tested to determine whether a condition is true or false. A loop executes instructions repeatedly while a condition is true. A for loop is used when a value runs for a starting point to an ending point with a consistent increment or decrement. And a do loop is used when we need to execute the loop body at least once before testing a condition. You can use Boolean variables to control a loop, setting a variable to be true before entering the loop, and then setting it to false to leave the loop. I hope this has helped in understanding the logic behind loops, in particular while loops, for loops, and do loops.